Everybody, and welcome once again to our survey of photography, Art History 240. So in this kind of quick sort of lecture, we're going to go through some of the history of photography and types of photographs that have been created. We'll also look at some of the function, although we'll talk about that in the coming weeks as well, and the groundwork laid for film, which was discussed in our week one announcement as well. So let's get going. In that week one announcement, I also kind of talked about, and let's delete that, this idea that photography sort of dates back to even the ancient Greek period. And we see that with things like the camera obscura. And the camera obscura, just means darkened room. And it's something that was created. It's essentially like you're blacking out a room and leaving like a pinhole in the wall so that light can shine through. And what happens with those camera obscuras then is that the light brings in what is outside. And so we can see that with this particular photograph. This is a photograph of standing inside of the camera obscura. And it was created by a Cuban-American artist named Morel. And what Morel does is he rents hotel rooms across the street from famous landmarks across the world. And then he turns that hotel room into a camera obscura. So he blacks out the windows, leaves that little hole in the blackout of the windows, and then what's outside or across the street from his hotel room, you see it projected here on the screen or on the wall. And then once he's created this camera obscura and he's got this scene displayed for him, he takes a photograph, a gelatin silver print, so a traditional kind of photograph of what he's seeing while standing inside that converted hotel room. Camera obscuras, again, these date back to the ancient period, but they were also used a lot during the Renaissance. And this was something, it was more like a tool, like a drawing tool, to help artists understand things like perspective and creating this sense of implied depth or depth that looks realistic in their drawings and paintings. And you can kind of see how if you were standing in this room, you could like hang a piece of paper on this wall and kind of trace out the lines of the Pantheon, and in this case it's the Pantheon in Paris, and recreate what you see while standing in that camera obscura. So these camera obscuras sort of laid the groundwork for what will become the camera later on. And sort of starts our foray into photography. That initial announcement also looked at this particular photograph. This is Louis Daguerre's Le Boulevard du Temple. But we've got some others displayed here too that kind of help show the history of photography. So photography is kind of a fun artistic medium in that it combines, like other artistic mediums, but maybe in a more direct way, combines scientific ideas with the visual world and recreating the visual world. And so this was sort of a process to get to where we are today, or even to get to something like Louis Daguerre's work or William Henry Fox Talbot's work, which you see down here. If you've ever played with a photographic darkroom, you're probably familiar with what's called a contact print. Now, contact print, essentially what you do is you take some found objects and you lay them on top of a light-sensitive piece of paper, or a piece of paper that has been treated with light-sensitive substances, and you expose that piece of paper to light. So the areas that are covered by those objects that you've collected are going to block the light from the paper, and the areas of the paper that are left exposed are going to sort of turn dark. And that's what we have. That's a contact print. That's what we have here with Anna Atkins. Anna Atkins created what are called cyanotypes. And cyanotypes use this contact printing method to create these photographic works of art. Anna Atkins, like other, um, in this case, it happens to be British people in the 19th century, are really interested in botany and creating like encyclopedic books of the plants that were found around their properties. They would often do this with like a small drawing, and then, as you can imagine, right, small drawing, and then a little paragraph about the plant or whatever it was they were talking about in these entries. And so Anna Atkins sort of created the same thing, just did so using photographs. So here she's collecting these different plants from around, I think these are flowers and algae from around her property. She's placing them on a piece of paper treated with this light sensitive solution, pressing down the flowers and the plants, and then exposing all of that to light. Now, the process that they used, the chemicals that they used in the 19th century, left the exposed area of the paper, made it turn blue. And that's where it gets its name, the cyanotype. So cyanotypes tend to have these blue backgrounds, and the objects blocking out the light turn out white. These cyanotypes are unique in that they are not reproducible. When we think of photography and photographs, traditional photographs, as being something that can be reproduced. They're prints. But cyanotypes are not reproducible. If Anna Atkins wanted to recreate this print, she would have to take all of these objects off this piece of paper and arrange them on another piece of paper. And you can imagine trying to put them in the exact same position is nearly impossible. So she wouldn't get the same print. She wouldn't be able to print this exact same photograph time and time again. Each of them would be unique. So they're unique prints that are produced in the negative, so the opposite of what we would see in real life, right? When we're looking at this in real life, these blue areas are white, and these areas that are coming off or appearing white in the photograph would be different colors. And so she's doing her print produces the opposite of that. So it's a unique negative print. Now, Louis Daguerre and William Henry Fox Talbot are two interesting artists that were working at the same time. Anna Atkins about the same time as well. But these were two artists that were working on ways to reproduce the world in a positive way. And I don't mean that in like a uplifting way. I mean that as in the opposite of what Anna Atkins was doing. So they wanted to reproduce the world as we actually saw it. And they did so using two different and very distinct methods. Louis Daguerre created the daguerreotype, and William Henry Fox Talbot created what's called the calotype. Daguerre was working in France. Talbot was working in England. Again, at the same time. There are several differences kind of between the processes that were used, and one big difference as far as accessibility. So, we're going to start with William Henry Fox Talbot here and the calotype. So, with the calotype, we have an image that is captured on a negative. Now, we don't really use film photographs or film photography very often anymore. Most of the photographs that we take are taken on a digital device. So think about going to your parents, your grandparents' home and digging through their boxes of photographs, and you'll come across a strip of negatives. That's what I'm talking about here. So those strips of negatives, and you hold them up to the light, and you can kind of see the photograph that's been captured. That's what Henry Fox Talbot captured. He captured the world on those negatives, and then he was able to shine light through that negative to produce a positive, to produce this calotype here. And so he was taking a negative and turning it into a positive, capturing a negative and then printing it on a piece of paper as a positive image. This is sort of traditional photography. But it's not the type of photography that really kicked off in the 19th century. The type of photography that really made a big impact in the 19th century was the daguerreotype. Now, the daguerreotype created unique images that positively reflected what we see in the world, right? So they were exactly what we see. The whites were white, the blacks were black. Daguerre created a camera, and inside that camera placed a piece of metal that was covered in light sensitive solution, and he exposed that to the outside world, exposed that camera to the outside world. So essentially for this photograph, the Boulevard du Temple, he set his camera on the ledge, the window sill of his apartment, and captured what was outside of his window. The way the daguerreotype worked was that it created a unique image. It was a unique image that was positive. Whites were white, blacks were black. But it was unique. He couldn't take this image then and reproduce it multiple times. He would have to start all over from scratch. And while these photographs created using the daguerreotype, especially in 1839, were really long exposures. That means it took a long time for that image to render on that piece of metal. There could still be some differences if he started this later. So he created one work and then one photograph and wanted to try again to create another one. The light would be different. The movement on the street would be different. The stillness on the street would be different. It would be slightly different. So there was no real way to reproduce exactly this image from the image he captured. Makes it unique. Fox Talbot, on the other hand, captured a negative, and then he could use that negative to produce multiple prints of this one scene that he was capturing. And in this case, he's just capturing the door to his barn on his property. I mentioned accessibility of these technologies, is what they were. And what happens, and this was in the video included in the week 1 announcement as well, is that the French government paid Louis Daguerre for his experiment, for his findings in creating and playing with the daguerreotype and making the daguerreotype. And the French government then made it free, accessible to anybody that wanted to use it. And so the 19th century, we have a lot of these photographs that became, or as photography became more popular, we have a lot of these photographs created using this daguerreotype process. So those, like if you think about going to like secondhand stores or antique stores, you see all those metal photographs. Those are all daguerreotypes. So this technology would make its way, throughout the world, all thanks to the French government purchasing this technology and making it freely available. I mentioned in the announcement to look for the humans, the people that were created or captured in some of these early images. So humans are the most common subject throughout time for photographs. And as you saw in that week 1 video that I included in that announcement, it's difficult to capture humans, especially if we think about this photograph here taking 5-10 minutes to render. We can't stay still for 5 or 10 minutes. It's just not possible. And so our movement generally in these early photographs would have been blurred, or there would have had to be extra steps taken to ensure that we were as still as possible. Well, it just so happens that when Louis Daguerre was creating the Boulevard du Temple, there was a bunch of activity on the street, but it all got blurred, right? So there's people walking up and down the street constantly. But at the corner, and you can see it right here where my mouse is circling here, at the corner of the Boulevard du Temple, there was a shoe shine station. And this person had stopped to get their shoe shined, and this process took long enough that it was able to render on this photograph. So technically, Louis Daguerre's Boulevard du Temple is considered the first photograph to capture a human. And here it is, getting your shoe shined. Photography will eventually lead or open the door for things like motion pictures. And let me get rid of some of these things here. There we go. And I included a little bit about Muybridge as well in our week one announcement. Muybridge is a really interesting character in that he's an English photographer, moved to the United States, and he was working as a land surveyor and landscape photographer. And eventually he would kind of go on to have some military contracts and doing land surveys, things like that. And he was hired by a man named Leland Stanford. And Leland Stanford was a railroad owner, but he also owned a lot of racehorses, hence the subject here of the work we're going to talk about. And Leland Stanford had gotten into a discussion with one of his cohorts, one of his colleagues, about the question was, does a horse lift all of its hooves off the ground while in a full gallop? And this bet, Leland Stanford, to show you how rich he was, railroad owner, horse owner, he had enough money that in 1878, he could put $25,000 down on this bet as to whether the horse lifts all four of its hooves off the ground or not. So he makes this bet, hires Muybridge, a photographer that he knows, to try to help him settle this bet. And why does he need photography? Why does he need a photographer to help him in this case? It's because this is a motion that is so fast that our human eye can't necessarily catch it accurately. And so we needed photography to slow down time, to capture movement, to get those actions and record them so that we could see them more clearly. The technology wasn't there, though, at the time. And so Muybridge worked with a man named John Isaacs. Isaacs is an engineer, and they develop a piece of the camera called the shutter that would function more quickly than previous camera shutters would. And the shutter is the piece of the camera that opens up when you think about using an old camera. When you push the button, the shutter opens up, lets light into the camera to kind of flood that light sensitive material that's inside there. And when you take your finger off the button for the camera, it closes the shutter. And so they were able to create a shutter and work on this technology to create this technology that would be able to capture and freeze motion, essentially. So a really quick shutter that would allow for these fast moving images to be captured. So Muybridge and Isaacs set up a series of 12 cameras on a racetrack, had one of Stanford's horses race down this track, and as the horse was moving across the track, the cameras were set to go off. And so they captured the horse at different parts of its gallop. So Muybridge then takes this and prints these photographs out and arranges them in time. Then we can see whether or not this horse, as it's running, we have all of these different stages, in this case with 16 stages, of this horse moving. And we can see that, in fact, this horse does, at a few points in this gallop, lifts all four of its hooves off the ground. And so this settles the bet. But Muybridge's fast shutter speed and this interest that he has in motion and movement and capturing kind of sequential activities of an object in motion will help to lead to the development of film. I often describe this as, I don't know if you all did this, but back in like elementary school, middle school, we used to draw these little like stick figures or whatever in the corner of our notebook and then flip through the notebook to make the little stick figure move, that animation. That's essentially what Muybridge does with these photographs. He sticks them on a device. Think like a Lazy Susan, if you're aware what that is. Puts them on a device and allows where you can spin the photograph. So the photographs can move in front of you. And so you can watch essentially this horse in motion as though you're watching a recording of a horse move. And this is going to then lead to moving pictures, and that develops into film and movies. And so, with this early chapter, with this early history of photography, we're really kind of thinking about the development of the technologies behind what were used to capture these images that we're seeing. Now, obviously, we have other developments that happen with photography and film, and this comes about especially because of the creation of things like our cell phones. But the idea is all the same, right? We're capturing and recording the world around us. And so, as we go through the course, we'll sort of look at some other examples of ways that artists have captured what they see, and we'll look at a few different functions. So here's a preview of some things that we're going to see. Now, I mentioned already that, I have all of these slide cues here. Let me get rid of them. That portraits were one of the most common types of photographs that have ever been created. And so here are two photographs, early photographs of portraits. This larger one is Sandra Bernhard, and this is a photograph taken by an artist a photographer named Nadar. And Nadar he's important to art in a lot of different ways. He actually helped to create an exhibition that would pave the way for artists like Renoir and Manet and Monet, Degas, to become more famous and have an outlet to sell their paintings. But he's an artist, a photographer in its own right. And what he was interested in was capturing the spirit of his sitter, of his subject. And so he would take these subjects, in this case, Sarah Bernhardt's an actress, and sort of strip them of all things related to their identity and create these photographs that were very simple, that sort of had you focus on them as a person versus their craft. And this other work that I have, pretty fun. This is Nadar in a balloon. He created a device to allow him, like a remote control, to allow him to take photographs from across the way. So he had a self-portrait of himself floating in a balloon. We'll also see photographs that are used as souvenirs. And these are called stereographs. Let me scoot this up so you can see it. Stereographs. And stereographs are two photographs printed on the same card, and they're the same photograph. So you can tell, right? Looking at these, the same exact image of the pyramids, the same exact image of the Colosseum. And these would be placed in a stereoscope, which is what you see here. And the stereoscope then would be held up to your eyes. And when you looked at this image through the stereoscope, it would give you this like 3D version of these stereographs, of these spaces that were captured. This is sort of like a Viewmaster, if you remember those from your childhood, where those plastic things you'd hold up to your head and they had the round card and give you this 3D view of different stories or whatnot. Same idea here. And so these stereographs were used or sold as souvenirs for tourists who were visiting these different places. They could purchase these stereographs and send them home and be able to talk about them, talk about the places that they visited, and have this 3D view of them. So that's another function of photography that we'll look at. We'll also see photography as a method of storytelling. And I won't go into this one too much, but I often talk about Henry Peach Robinson's Fading Away as this example of like early Photoshop. Essentially, even in the 1800s, we had photographers who were cutting apart different photographs and piecing them back together to tell a story. So this is a story that is created from 5 different photographs. This never happened. He kind of pieced these different pieces together, put these different pieces together to create what looks like the death of this girl being viewed by her sister, her mom, maybe her dad. but to create these sort of fictionalized stories. Um, art will also become art. Photography will also become sort of embedded with the art world, and we see that with somebody like Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz was an American who owned some galleries in New York, and he would sort of take this big leap and hang photographs alongside of fine art or paintings, sculptures, and sort of elevated photography from being this sort of um, scientific tool to capture the world to being something that could be used to create art. And so his steerage is an example of that we'll talk about later. And then things like social commentary. And that's what we have here with Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange was a photographer. She also worked in California with not with Muybridge, but um, as did Muybridge. And she was responsible for capturing kind of the plight of migrant workers. And this is one of her famous photographs, The Migrant Mother, that you probably have seen before. If not, I'm sure you'll run into it later on. But this is a work that captured life during the Great Depression, during the Dust Bowl, to help show the conditions that Americans were living in during the Dust Bowl, during the 1930s, to help to justify programs designed to support these migrant workers in the West. And so we'll look at that as well. So all this stuff coming up. This week's kind of work is to give you an idea of photography, the history of photography, the background, and have you start thinking about these different uses that photography has been used for. There's lots of them. I've just touched on a couple of them here, but we'll see them kind of throughout the term. And as you go through and you're looking at these more traditional print photography examples, I want you to think also about how this compares, these print versions compare to how we use photography in our digital world today. So we'll be thinking about that as well. If you have any questions, reach out, let me know. I'm happy to answer any questions. And until then, I will talk to you all on discussion boards.